You're listening to the Stable Management Podcast, where we discuss the barn management topics that you're passionate about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stable Management Podcast. Our goal is to bring you a real-world look into the parts of horse farm management that you love or hate most, such as stall bedding, farm equipment, and pasture maintenance. During each bi-monthly episode, we'll be joined by an expert guest who shares their experiences with and perspectives on an important stable management topic. I'm your host, Hailey Kerstetter, and today my guest is Dr. Katie McKenna from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Hailey. I appreciate you having me on your podcast, especially during this chilly time of year.
Yes, our topic is perfect for the weather. We're going to be talking about conditioning horses during winter, and I'm going to jump right into this topic because I know we have a lot to talk about with it. So I was wondering if you could tell me what are some of the main concerns surrounding conditioning horses in the winter, particularly if you live in a cold climate.
So in managing the horse as an athlete in colder temperatures, the overall concern is thermoregulation. This incorporates whether to clip your horse, to not clip your horse, blanketing practices, looking at feeding management, and how to best incorporate exercise during these frigid temperatures. As you can imagine, there are many studies out of the Nordic and Scandinavian countries where it's really cold that investigate different aspects of how cold weather impacts equids. So when we look at horses, they are homeothermic or warm-blooded, and they keep their core body temperature within narrow limits, no matter the fluctuations in the ambient air temperature. Additionally, they are also endothermic, so they produce their own heat. So when we think of thermoregulation, there is this thing called lower critical temperature, or the LCT. And this is the lowest temperature an animal can withstand before needing to produce extra energy to maintain the regular body heat. So, for example, there have been studies done in horses, like standard-bred adults, when acclimatized to 15 to 20 degrees Celsius weather, their LCT is 5 degrees Celsius. Another study looked at fed and cold adapted quarter horse yearlings, and their LCT is negative 11 degrees Celsius. So when we start getting into cold below that lower critical temperature, the body must produce more heat by increasing the metabolic function to maintain a core body temperature. And in horses, that normally is 37 to 39 degrees Celsius. So as the core body temperature drops, the efficiency of the temperature regulation system decreases and mental and physical functions will be disturbed. And at around 27 to 30 degrees Celsius, there'll be a loss of consciousness. So that's when you start getting into those extreme cold temperatures. So the lowest critical temperature is very much horse dependent, as individual horses have individual needs. So this is dependent on age, breed, acclimatization, general health, which includes like metabolic status, looking at their hair quality, previous or current injuries, and their current body condition. We can also look at their level of work and their athletic goals, whether this horse is showing regularly or if it's an older horse just being maintained out on pasture. So there's definitely a spectrum of management practices during the wintertime that needs to be adjusted to all of these factors.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you bring up injuries as one of the things that might affect the lowest critical temperature of a specific horse, because I feel like people might forget that one, and more so think about, like how much hair their horse has or how old they are.
Right. So, when we think about musculoskeletal injury in these cold months, when we think about it from like a scientific or study perspective, there's peripheral vasoconstriction. So there's a redistribution of blood from the peripheral tissues, like the skin and all the musculature in their limbs, to the central nervous system and the core where their internal organs are, to it's a safety mechanism to protect them. So basically, this is to decrease heat loss, and the blood flow to the resting muscles is decreased. So with this decrease in muscle temperature, the contractile components within the muscle fibers don't cycle as quickly. Also, cold weather conditions may influence the expansion and the contraction of muscles, of tendons, of bones in different ways than we see in warmer weather. And there also may be an increase in stiffness in joints that may trigger subtle movements that can heighten nociceptive pain responses. And when you think about it, in low temperatures, there may be an increase in the viscosity of the synovial or the joint fluid, and this makes joints stiffer and perhaps more sensitive to pain, because there's more mechanical stress due to increased friction between the tissues and the joint surface. Another interesting piece that I found that barometric pressure changes may cause a transient disequilibrium and body pressure that may sensitize nerve endings, and nerves may not fire as rapidly as well. There isn't a ton of literature within the equine realm, but there are multiple human studies that look at the influence of weather conditions, particularly cold weather, on chronic pain. So one study looked at rheumatology patients, and 74% of these patients reported weather sensitivity, with 72% saying that low temperature is more frequently associated with worsening of symptoms. There's another study surveying almost 600 patients with chronic pain, and 60.7% of them stated that cold was considered to influence their pain. So that's something that we can pull into the horses if they have any sort of history of osteoarthritis, making sure that we're cognizant of that going into the colder months. Along another vein, that as people in the hunter jumper world, like my background, we don't always think about, but it's more prominent in the racing industry, is airway cooling and mucosal injury during cold weather exercise. Something a little bit different than just our regular musculoskeletal injury. So with exercise, there's an increase in gas exchange, which helps support the increased metabolic activity during exercise. So when cold air is introduced into the airway, it needs to be warmed and moistened, and this protects the distal airways from cooling and desiccation. And 80% of human athletes that routinely perform strenuous exercise in cold conditions, they have a high incidence of chronic airway inflammation. And in the acute phase response, there can be an exercise-induced asthma, and it's a transient self-limiting bronchoconstriction after this increased respiratory rate at work in cold temperatures. And then the late phase response includes airway inflammation. And so there's one study with horses that investigated the temperature within the airways, both before and after high intensity exercise. And then they also looked at the cell types within the lung tissues, both pre and post exercise. So it did show that intrapulmonary airways in horses are exposed to unconditioned or cold air during exercise, and that this exposure contributes to airway inflammation. So all this information, both the airway and the musculoskeletal side of things, from human medicine, it can be translated into our equine companions, and it can help us mitigate risks during conditioning and how to manage pain when it's cold out as well.
Yeah, just even thinking about myself in cold weather, I have a harder time breathing when it's super cold if I'm exercising outside. And just this morning, I bent down to pick out my horse's hooves, and my knees started yelling at me for doing that when it was super cold. So I can imagine that my horse, carrying a much larger load, experiences these things possibly at an even higher rate. So that's important for us to think about. And when we're thinking about these various injuries, is there anything that riders or trainers can do to reduce their horse's risk?
Yeah, so being a veterinarian, I always recommend, prior to these winter months, having us come out. We would love to do a full physical exam, do a gait or a lameness exam, and then also do some metabolic testing if it's appropriate. It's a really good way to have your horse evaluated and address any issues prior to the upcoming cold months. Because like I said, any abnormalities that can be exacerbated by the cold, and musculoskeletal injury can be worsened due to the diversion of the peripheral blood flow. So it's important to have like a good rehabilitation plan in place. And also, like we've been discussing, making sure that you have pain management with horses, for horses with evidence of osteoarthritis, and have that in place before the cold weather in combination with an appropriate exercise plan for your horse. Like I mentioned, ensuring your horse's metabolic status is normal, whether that's equine metabolic syndrome, and having your older horses tested for equine Cushing's or PPID. With these horses, if they do come back positive, we can make further recommendations for management in terms of like their dietary needs, their hair coat and blanketing, and any musculoskeletal monitoring. Going back to the airway, we recommend ensuring good quality air. So that's both inside the barn when they're stabled and areas where you may ride as well. So when preparing for this, I found one study from the 1970s that looked at respiration and exercise horses wearing cold weather masks. How they kept the masks on the horses during exercise, I am uncertain, but they wanted to make sure that there was no impact on normal airflow as the mask was helping warm and moisten the air. And there were no significant changes in like respiratory rate, tracheal pressure, gas tensions, or like pH in the blood with or without the mask. And I did do a quick search online, and there was only one website that sold masks that were similar. So, might be a good option if your horse has a history of asthma or any sort of upper or lower airway issues, but also might be a little bit challenging to keep on.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to make my horse wear that, but I mean, if your horse will tolerate it, it might be a good option.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of warm up when the temperatures are below freezing, and what would an ideal warm up look like for you?
Yes, definitely. So, horses that are in work, they're exposed to a variety of different thermoregulatory demands within the same day. So they're kept in a warm environment in their barn overnight, and then they're turned out in cold ambient temperatures, and then they receive short periods of high intensity exercise several times a week. So we recommend like a long, slow warm up in addition to an extended cool down period to help divert the blood flow to working muscles. Start long and low on the buckle, at the walk and the trot, just sort of getting warmed up. And then start with like an engaged walk and incorporate some pole work as well to get the distal limbs moving. Also importantly is thermoregulation management during and after exercise to ensure proper recovery from work. So there have been studies done looking into heat dissipation in regards to body clipping and not body clipping and blanketing during and after exercise. Horses have a high metabolic capacity, but such a small surface area for the dissipation of heat. And when they're in exercise, only 20% of metabolism and muscle cells is used for work, and the remaining 80% actually becomes heat. So skin blood flow increases internal body heating, and it transfers the heat from the body core to the muscles and the skin surface, which is even more apparent in these cold weather months where so much of their heat is in their core. So if vasodilation isn't sufficient to dissipate heat, that's when sweating starts. So this study looked at unclipped horses, and at the onset of exercise, they had a higher surface temperature versus clipped horses, which makes sense. They have a thicker coat. But the respiratory rate and the surface temperature after exercise took longer to return to normal on the unclipped horses and the horses that actually had blankets on after exercise. Additionally, when exercised, the horses became wet and sweaty, as we all know, and this heat production overrides the evaporative mechanisms, and the wet hair coat actually reduces the insulation properties of the coat. So the unclipped horses had a significant increase in skin moisture content compared to the body clipped horses, that their value is actually 0. And so body clipping your horse allows for better heat dissipation post-exercise. So basically, horses that are exercised at a high intensity may benefit from clipping. And the study showed that recovery is delayed if a horse is blanketed immediately post-exercise. And by that, it's more so their thick like daytime or turnout blankets rather than a cooler that actually helps with the heat dissipation.
That's super interesting, but it totally makes sense when you phrase it that way. So when we're talking about these working horses in cold temperatures, do any of them need additional calories provided by their diet if they're going to be in work during the winter?
Yes, dietary changes are really important in cold weather, whether it's a young horse, an older horse, a horse in work, or a horse in turnout. So energy demands increase to counteract heat loss in cold temperatures. There are opposing demands on the metabolism. There's an upregulation to preserve the body temperature, but then this depletes the energy reserves. So it can be really hard for horses to maintain a positive energy balance in the cold months. And this is especially prominent in horses that are outdoors all the time and they need to be fed more. Studies have shown that adult quarter horses need 2.5% more energy for maintenance for each degree of Celsius below their lower critical temperature. And another study saw that growing quarter horse or quarter horse crosses need 1.3% extra energy for maintenance for each degree Celsius below zero. And for any sort of moderate weight gain, on top of that, an extra 0.7% energy. But on the flip side, digestion itself produces heat. So you want to ensure that your horse has access to good quality forage more regularly than they do in the summer months. And on the other side of things, you have to think about hydration and water intake as well. We think about that during the summer months when it's hot all the time, but it's just as important when it's cold outside. So you want to ensure that your horse has frost-free water, offer a salt block, or add electrolytes to your horse's diet to help encourage drinking. And heated drinking water has been shown to increase water intake compared to water near freezing temperatures.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of our more popular topics that I often hear our readers asking about on both the horse and stable management is hydration during the winter in basically any and every form of the topic. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Do you enjoy the Stable Management Podcast? Want to learn even more about horse healthcare? Get your management and industry questions answered at Ask the Horse Live, a free audio event available exclusively from thehorse.com. Each Ask the Horse Live episode focuses on a specific equine healthcare topic chosen by our editors. We gather leading veterinarians, researchers, and industry experts to tackle your toughest questions. You can also hear on-demand episodes of Ask the Horse on thehorse.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So, talking about horses that maybe will have some time off during the winter, is there a place for purposefully giving your horse letdown time, and are there any potential benefits to that?
Yes, I think from both a physiological and a mental perspective, it's a good time to give your horse time off. So studies have shown in many species, not just horses, that hypometabolism is an adaptive response to reduced energy consumption over the winter months. There was one study in white-tailed deer that showed a loss of body weight as well as a reduction in thyroidal and adrenal activity over the winter, which then goes back to normal in March and April. And then the study also looked at free-living Carnidoo ponies and how they had a similar seasonal fluctuation in metabolism. So the winter months are actually a good excuse to allow your horse to just be a horse, and it lets their bodies focus more on thermoregulation maintenance and gives them a mental break from like the horse show season, especially again in the hunter jumper world coming off of indoors. I would still recommend maintaining some low level of work if they are an athletic prospect, even if it is just ground exercises. Bringing them back in the spring mentally refreshed and strong from ground strengthening may set you up for success in the upcoming show season. But again, this is all very horse dependent. You know, some horses always need to be in some level of work. You know, sometimes your goals as the owner are a little bit more strenuous than giving them the time off. But it really is a good excuse to give them a little bit of time and give yourself a little bit of time as well.
Yeah, so speaking of groundwork and ground strengthening exercises, as someone who doesn't know a whole lot about that, what exercises can you do from the ground to help your horse maintain some level of fitness when you choose not to ride, or maybe it's just not possible based on the weather in your area?
Yeah. So ground exercises, I think, are a great way to still interact and bond with your horse while building strength and improving proprioception that can be appropriate in any weather condition. Again, we recommend working with your veterinarian to make sure that there aren't any musculoskeletal injuries that these exercises may be contraindicated for. So where I work, we regularly recommend Hillary Clayton's book, Activate Your Horse's Core, for our patients. And most of our clients are really good about doing these core strengthening and proprioceptive exercises. So some of those include carrot stretches, so using a high value treat to have your horse stretch from the left to the right, up and down between their knees, working on some pelvic tucks and some sternal lifts to just range of motion, picking up their leg and gently extending their fetlock and their knees and their hocks just to warm them up, warm those joints up a little bit. Additionally, I really like balance pads. I know there's some expensive brands that are specifically for horses out there that come in different firmnesses. I actually just got some for my horse off of Amazon pretty cheap. They're like yoga blocks, and you can have them stand on them, and it helps not only with proprioception, but core strengthening as well. And then, other work such as backing, hill work, and going over poles in hand are all really good to keep your horse in shape.
Okay, so I have one final question for you, and this is something that I ask all of my guests about their respective topic. So, what are some common misconceptions that you hear about conditioning or just keeping horses during the winter?
So, my biggest one that I always laugh at myself about is just because you're cold doesn't mean your horse is cold. Horses are so much more tolerant of the cold than we are. And just to make sure your horse isn't being over blanketed, I, in the past, always had so many blankets on my horse, and then I let his coat grow out last winter, and I think I put a sheet on him like twice. He's in this nice insulated bank barn, and even though I'm coming down into the barn all cold and bundled up, he's quite comfortable. Again, it depends on body clipping as well, but horses actually do quite well in the cold, better than the heat. So just because you're cold doesn't mean they are.
Yeah, I laughed when you said that because I've heard that before, of course, but I still have a hard time believing it, I think. And I still have to constantly remind myself, no, he's fine. No, he's fine. Stop messing with him so much.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but it's been awesome talking with you, Dr. McKenna. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you all for listening today. Please remember to like this podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and recommend the Stable Management Podcast to a friend.